The train left Dusty Creek Station without ceremony. It didn't slow, didn't whistle, didn't offer so much as a courteous shudder of regret. One moment it was there, iron and steam and the smell of coal smoke hanging in the afternoon air. And then it was gone, and Nora Calloway was standing on the platform with a leather traveling case in one hand and a letter in the other, watching the last car disappear around the bend where the tracks curved south toward Tucson. She read the letter again. She had read it many times since leaving St. Louis. The paper had gone soft at the folds, the way paper does when a person keeps returning to it, not because they've forgotten the words, but because they haven't yet decided what to do with them. Dear Mrs. Calloway, I will meet you personally at Dusty Creek Station on the afternoon of September the 3rd. The ride to Ashford Ridge takes no more than 2 hours by horse, and I will see to it that the journey is comfortable. I look forward to making your acquaintance in person, and I give you my word that I will not waste the trust you have placed in this arrangement. Yours sincerely, James Ashford, September the 3rd. That was today. That had been 3 hours ago. Nora folded the letter carefully and tucked it back into her coat pocket in the place she'd been keeping it since the agency in St. Louis had handed it to her with a sealed envelope and a form to sign. She looked around the station. There was a water barrel on the near end of the platform, 2 wooden benches that had been painted white at some point in the distant past, and a hand-lettered sign that read, Dusty Creek Territory of Arizona Population 187. Behind the ticket window, a thin man in his late 50s sat watching her with the particular expression of someone who knows something they are not sure they ought to say. Nora had spent 4 years as a field nurse during the war. She had learned to read faces the way a doctor reads symptoms, not for what they showed, but for what they were working to contain. She walked to the window. Excuse me, she said. I'm looking for a rider from Ashford Ridge. Was any message left for a Mrs. Calloway? The man took off his hat and turned it slowly in his hands. He had the careful eyes of a man who had learned that discretion was cheaper than trouble. No message, ma'am. Are you certain? I'm certain. Do you know Ashford Ridge? Nora asked. Is it a well-known property? He looked at her for a moment that lasted slightly too long. Everybody knows Ashford Ridge, he said. James Ashford runs it, has done since his father passed, going on 9 years. It's the largest spread between the canyon and the river. Then you know Mr. Ashford. Is he a man who keeps his word? Another pause. What's your business with Mr. Ashford, if you don't mind my asking? Nora looked the man directly in the eye. I am his intended bride, she said. We arranged a marriage through correspondence. He was to meet me here this afternoon. The silence that settled over the station was the kind that carries weight. The man, his name was Pete Haskell, according to the small painted sign on the wall behind him, set his hat back on his head slowly. Well, he said, that's something. It is something, Nora agreed. It is something I traveled 4 days on a train for. Is there a livery in town? I'd like to hire a wagon or a rider to take me out to the ranch. Town's 3 miles east, Haskell said. He hesitated. But the road goes through Copper Canyon, ma'am. It'll be dark in there before you're through, and there's been some trouble on that stretch lately. Riders, men nobody's putting their name to. I appreciate your concern, Nora said, but I didn't come all the way from St. Louis to sit on a bench. She picked up her case. Ma'am, Haskell's voice came after her low and almost reluctant, as though the words had been pulled out of him against his better judgment. At least take the road, not the canyon path. It's longer, but it's safer. Nora paused. She looked at the sky. The sun was already angling west, throwing long shadows across the platform boards. 3 miles to town, then 2 hours to the ranch. If she took the longer road, she'd be walking until after dark. How much shorter is the canyon path? Haskell turned his hat in his hands. Cuts off near 2 miles. She looked at him for a moment. His face was careful, more careful than a man needed to be when he was just giving directions to a stranger. Thank you for your help, she said. She walked toward Copper Canyon with her traveling case in her hand, her boots already raising small clouds of dust from the dry September earth. Behind her, she heard Pete Haskell settle heavily back onto his stool, and she had the distinct impression of a man watching something he wished he could undo. The canyon was quieter than she expected. Not peaceful quiet, not the easy stillness of a place where nothing was happening. This was the tight, coiled quiet of a place where something had recently gone wrong and hadn't quite finished going wrong yet. The walls of red sandstone rose 60 feet on either side, and the light that made it down between them was the amber-slanted light of late afternoon. The creek ran along the western edge of the path, cold and low, and making a sound that was almost but not quite enough to cover other sounds. Nora had walked through worse places, She had walked through a field hospital at Shiloh with blood on her boots and a man screaming in every cot. She had walked through the streets of St. Louis on the night her husband Robert died of the fever he'd brought home from the war, with their daughter sleeping in the next room, and the weight of what came next pressing down on her chest like a stone. She knew how to keep moving when stopping felt easier. She noticed the horse first. It was standing off the path near the eastern canyon wall, reins trailing in the dust. One foreleg lifted slightly as though it had been about to step and thought better of it. Its ears were moving in two directions at once, tracking sounds Nora couldn't yet hear. It was a gray horse, well built with the muscled quarters of an animal that had been worked hard and fed well. The kind of horse that cost real money. The saddle was still on. There was blood-dried dark on the left stirrup. Nora set down her case. She walked to the horse the way she'd learned to approach anything, frightened, steady. No sudden movement, voice low and even. "Easy," she said. "Easy now. I'm not going to hurt you." The horse let her take the reins. She looked at the stirrup. She looked at the ground. The earth near the base of the canyon wall was disturbed, scuffed, and gouged with the drag marks of something heavy that had been pulled or had fallen. There were smaller rocks scattered in a pattern that wasn't random, and there was blood on the stones. Not a great deal of blood, but enough to mean someone needed help. Nora Calloway had spent 4 years in field hospitals. In that time, she had learned that there were two kinds of people in the world, those who walked away from blood and those who walked toward it. She had never once been the first kind. She followed the trail. She found him 15 feet from the canyon wall, half buried under a collapse of sandstone and loose shale. Not fully buried, the slide had caught him at the edge, pinning his left leg under a flat slab of rock the size of a barn door and catching his right side against the base of the wall. His head had taken a blow somewhere above the right ear. She could see the matted dark hair and the dark stain spreading through it. His face was the particular gray-white of a man whose body was working very hard to keep him alive. But his chest was moving. Nora knelt beside him and pressed 2 fingers to the side of his throat. The pulse was there, thin, irregular, working too hard. But there. "Hey," she said sharply. "Can you hear me?" Nothing. She shifted position and gripped his shoulder. "Wake up. I need you to wake up right now." Something moved in his face. A flinch. The muscles around his eyes tightening against the light, or against the pain, or against the effort of consciousness. "That's right," she said. "You stay with me. I'm going to get this weight off your leg, and then I'm going to get you somewhere safe. Do you understand me?" He didn't answer. She started moving rocks. It took the better part of an hour. The big slab she couldn't shift alone. It was too heavy, too flat, nothing to get leverage under. But she worked at the smaller stones, stacked on top of it, pulling them free one by one. And when the pile was reduced, she took the leather strap from her traveling case, the one that reinforced the side panels, and threaded it under the near edge of the slab, and used the case itself as a fulcrum, the way she'd once used a rifle butt to lift a fallen beam off a soldier at Cold Harbor. The slab lifted 2 inches. She pulled his leg free. She ran her hands along the bone through the fabric of his trousers, the way the senior surgeon at the field hospital had shown her, not the way a woman checks for injury in polite company, but the way a person checks when the answer matters. The fibula was cracked, lower leg not the joint. The skin hadn't broken through, which meant no infection risk from the break itself, which meant she had time to do this properly. Her hands were bleeding from the rocks by then. She didn't notice until she saw the blood on his boot. She sat back on her heels and looked at him properly for the first time. He was a large man, broad through the chest and shoulders, with the build of someone who worked with his body, not for appearance but because the work required it. His clothes were well made, a dark wool coat that had cost more than a working cowhand's monthly wages, boots with a particular quality of leather that didn't come from a general store catalog. His hands even slack and still had the calluses of a man who worked every day, but the cut of his coat, the quality of his shirt beneath it spoke of someone who didn't need to save his good clothes for Sundays. She wondered who he was. She wondered more urgently who had done this to him, because this was not an accident. The rocks might be natural enough, canyon walls shed stone. It happened. But the blood on the stirrup wasn't from falling rocks, and the drag marks in the earth weren't from a man who had simply fallen. Someone had struck him before he'd come off that horse. Someone had made sure he came off it. She began tearing strips from the bottom of her petticoat. He came around while she was wrapping his head. Not fully, not coherent, not truly present, but his eyes opened to slits and his mouth moved with the effort of someone trying to remember how language worked. "You're all right," Nora said. She kept her voice the way she'd kept it in every field tent. she'd ever worked. Steady, matter-of-fact, the voice of someone for whom everything was manageable if you kept your hands moving. You have a head wound and a broken leg. I've got the bleeding slowed. I'm going to get you somewhere to rest. His eyes focused on her with visible effort. They were dark, almost black in the canyon's amber light, deep set with the lines around them of a man who spent most of his days squinting against the sun. Who he started. My name is Nora Calloway. I'm passing through the canyon. I found you under a rock slide. She tied off the bandage. What's your name? A long pause. Something moved across his face, a calculation she could almost see him making. Cole, he said. Cole Delaney. All right, Cole Delaney. Can you ride if I get you in the saddle? I can try. That's not what I asked. Something shifted in his expression. Even through the pain, through the fever that was already beginning to build beneath his skin, there was a flicker of something that might have been amusement in a different situation. Yes, he said, I can ride. There's a cabin, he said as she worked to get him sitting upright. He went white with the pain of it, but he didn't make a sound, the specific silence of a man who had decided that making a sound wasn't something he was going to do. Quarter-mile east. Creek runs behind it. Been empty since the Harmon family moved out last spring. He stopped, breathed, let the wave of pain pass. You can get me there. I can get you there, Nora agreed. It was the hardest thing she had done since the war. He was twice her weight, and he could contribute perhaps a quarter of the effort required to get himself upright. She braced him against the canyon wall and got his arm over her shoulder and walked him to the horse one grinding step at a time, talking the whole way not to comfort him exactly, but to give him something to track, besides the pain to keep his mind working, to remind him that there was a reason to stay conscious. Tell me about the cabin, she said. How long has it been empty? What shape is it in? Roof's sound, he said through his teeth. Creek's clean. Somebody left wood. Good. What else is in the area? Homestead's neighbors. A pause that lasted slightly too long. Homestead about 3 miles east. Good people. She noted the hesitation and didn't press it. All right, let's get you on the horse first. Getting him into the saddle was the kind of work that required her to use every technique she'd developed over 4 years of moving injured men, the angle of leverage, the timing of effort, the particular way you brace your own body to absorb weight that the other person can't carry. He made it up with a sound that would have been a scream from a man less determined not to make one. She got his broken leg free of the stirrup, picked up her traveling case, took the horse's reins, and started east. The cabin was where he'd said it would be. It was small and bare and smelled of disuse, but the roof was whole, and the creek was running cold and clear outside the back wall, and someone had left a neat stack of dry wood beside the fireplace, as though they'd known someone would need it someday. There was a cot in the corner, and a table and 2 chairs, and a shelf on the wall with an empty tin cup on it. Nora got him inside, got him onto the cot, got his boot off the broken leg, which required the kind of controlled, precise work that left her hands shaking when it was done, not from weakness, but from the sustained effort of not hurting him worse. She set the leg as straight as she could using 2 straight branches she found in the woodpile and the remaining strips of her petticoat to hold them. She built the fire. She boiled creek water and cleaned the head wound with the carbolic solution she carried in the small medical kit at the bottom of her traveling case. She had not traveled without a medical kit since 1862, and she was not going to stop now. She packed the wound with clean cloth and bound it properly. She did all of this with bleeding hands and an empty stomach, and the awareness working quietly at the back of her mind that the men who had done this to him might come through that door at any moment. Cole Delaney, if that was his name, watched her from the cot with those dark eyes half open, tracking her movements with the careful attention of a man who was cataloging information he wasn't yet sure what to do with. You didn't have to do any of this, he said at one point. No, Nora agreed. She didn't look up from washing her hands in the boiled water. Why did you? She considered the question with the seriousness it deserved. In the field hospitals, the surgeons had sometimes asked her why she kept coming back, why a woman who had already done more than her share kept volunteering for another rotation, another ward, another 12-hour stretch in a tent that smelled of gangrene and despair. She had never had a satisfying answer for them. Because you were breathing, she said finally, and I was there. He was quiet for a while after that. Then, what are you doing in Copper Canyon with a traveling case and no horse? Nora finished cleaning her hands and turned to look at him. The fire was going well now, and its light fell across the cabin with a warmth that made the bare walls look almost welcoming. I came out to Arizona to meet a man I've never seen, she said. We arranged a marriage through correspondence. He was supposed to meet me at the station in Dusty Creek this afternoon. She paused. He didn't show. Something moved in his face. That complicated movement she was already beginning to recognize. A man feeling something he had decided he wasn't going to say. What's his name? He asked. This man. James Ashford, Nora said. He owns a ranch called Ashford Ridge. The station agent said it's the largest in 3 counties. The silence that followed lasted exactly long enough to mean something. You know him, Nora said. It wasn't a question. I know of him, Cole said, carefully. Most people in this part of the territory do. Is he a decent man? Cole Delaney looked at the ceiling of the empty cabin for a long moment. I suppose that depends, he said, on what you've been counting on him for. Nora studied him. He met her eyes without flinching, but she had learned in 4 years of reading wounded men that what a person chose not to say was often the most useful information they offered. Then something must have happened to keep him from the station, she said. She tied the last bandage, which means I either find my way to the ranch or I wait and see if he sends someone for me. She looked at Cole. For now I'm here, and you're here, and you need to sleep. Miss Calloway. Nora. He said it the same way he'd taken in the name of Ashford Ridge, carefully filing it away. The men who did this, they won't stop looking. Then we'll deal with that when they come, she said. Right now you're going to sleep, and I'm going to watch the door. He looked at her for a moment with those dark, considering eyes. Then, as though arriving at a decision, you don't have to watch the door. I know I don't have to, she said. Go to sleep, Mr. Delaney. He went to sleep. The fever hit before midnight, as she had known it would. With a wound like his head injury exposure, the physical shock of the break fever wasn't a question of if, but when. She had the willow bark she carried in her medical kit ready before his skin even began to burn, steeping it in creek water she'd kept at a slow boil all evening. She got it into him in the brief surfacing windows when the fever lifted enough for him to swallow. She sat up through the night. She had done this before, had sat through the long hours in field tents, with men who might or might not be there in the morning, monitoring breathing and pulse and temperature, adjusting what she could adjust and accepting what she couldn't. She knew the sound of breathing that was working too hard. She knew when the rhythm changed. She had learned through 4 years of practice to keep one part of her mind always listening, even when the rest of her was doing something else. His breathing steadied around 3 in the morning. She let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding for hours. Outside in the darkness above the creek, she heard horses. Not close somewhere on the ridge to the north, moving slowly. The careful, methodical movement of riders who were searching rather than traveling. 2 horses, she estimated, maybe 3, moving back and forth along the ridge in the particular pattern of men looking for something they knew was approximately there. Nora stood cross to the window and looked out. There was nothing to see, just the darkness and the stars and the pale line of the creek. The horses were above her, hidden by the ridge line. She put out the lamp. She sat down in the chair beside the cot, close enough to feel his pulse with 2 fingers resting lightly on his wrist. And she did not move, and she did not make a sound, and she listened to those horses work the ridge back and forth for what felt like a very long time. Then they moved on, fading north toward the canyon road. She sat in the dark for a while after that. She thought about St. Louis, about the narrow house on Olive Street, where she had lived with Robert and their daughter Clara for 4 years before the war changed everything. About the letter from the field surgeon who had been with Robert when the fever took him, telling her that he had gone peacefully, that he had not suffered, that he had spoken of her and Clara at the end, the standard letter, the kind the surgeons wrote in batches because there were always more to write. She thought about the agency in St. Louis where she had walked on a Tuesday afternoon in March 8 months ago. About the clerk who had shown her the files, men looking for wives in the territories. Men who needed partners as much as they needed romance. Men who were honest about what they were offering and what they needed in return. About the file for James Ashford, 35 years old. Rancher, widower, seeking a capable woman of steady character for a life partnership. Am not a romantic man, but am an honest one. Would not waste your time and ask only that you not waste mine. She had read it 3 times in the clerk's office and then asked for the file to take home overnight. She had written back 6 days later. The letters they had exchanged over the following 5 months were unlike any letters Nora had ever written or received. Not love letters, nothing so soft or uncertain as that. They were letters between 2 people who had both been through enough that they'd lost patience for pretense. He wrote about the ranch with the focused clarity of a man who had spent years building something and knew exactly what it had cost him. She wrote about the hospital work with the same directness and about Clara, who was 12 now, and living with Nora's sister in St. Louis while Nora made this journey. He wrote back about Clara with a care that surprised her, asked specific questions, remembered details she'd mentioned in passing, showed her without saying so directly that he was paying attention. The last letter he'd sent had been different from the others, more careful, as though he'd written it and revised it and written it again. I want to say plainly that what I am offering is a genuine partnership and not merely a legal arrangement. I have thought about this more than I expected to, and I find that what I am hoping for is something real. I recognize that is a larger thing to ask than I originally intended, and I will understand if the terms of this arrangement feel different to you than they did when we began. She had read that letter 4 times. She was thinking about it now in the dark of the cabin, with his pulse steady under her fingers, and the fire burning low, and the creek running cold outside the wall, when the man on the cot said quietly, "You're still here." His voice was rough from the fever, but clearer than it had been. The fever had broken. She could feel it in the temperature of his skin when she touched his forehead. "I said I would be," Nora said. He turned his head toward her in the darkness. She could see the pale oval of his face, the dark eyes finding her by the faint glow of the fire's embers. "The horses on the ridge," he said. "They moved on. You put out the lamp." "Yes." A pause. "That was smart." "I know it was," she said. Something that might have been the beginning of a different kind of expression moved across his face, something that might have been a smile in better circumstances. "How long have you been sitting there?" "Most of the night." "You should have slept. You weren't stable enough." She withdrew her fingers from his wrist. "Your fever broke. Your color's better. Your breathing is even." She paused, weighing. "I'm willing to sleep for 2 hours if you stay quiet." "I'll stay quiet." "Good." She settled back into the chair, crossed her arms, and closed her eyes. She was almost there, almost at the edge of sleep, when he said quietly, "Nora." "What?" "Thank you." She didn't open her eyes. "You can thank me when you are walking on 2 feet, she said. "Until then, be quiet and let me sleep." He lay still and watched the ceiling. The fire had burned down to coals, and the cabin was lit only by the faint pre-dawn light coming through the gaps in the western wall. Beside him in the chair she'd pulled from the corner, the woman from Kansas City, no, from St. Louis, slept with her arms crossed and her chin angled slightly down, and the expression of someone who had decided to sleep and was going to do it properly whether the world cooperated or not. He looked at her for a long moment. He thought about the pulse she'd been monitoring, 2 fingers steady and attentive for most of the night. He thought about the lamp she'd put out without hesitation when she'd heard the horses. He thought about the breaks in his legs set cleanly and bound well with strips of cloth she'd torn from her own clothing. He thought about the name she'd said there in the canyon while she was unwrapping his bandage to check the wound. James Ashford. He owns a ranch called Ashford Ridge. She had said it the way you say the name of a person you've been expecting. Carefully, with a kind of weight behind it. James Ashford, he had ridden out that morning to Dusty Creek Station alone without telling a soul, because there was one thing in his life that he'd chosen to keep private, one piece of himself that he hadn't shared with his foreman or his neighbors or his enemies. The letters, the woman coming from St. Louis, the decision he'd made after 9 years of running this ranch and fighting for it to stop running it entirely alone. He had not wanted Ward Sinclair to know about the letters. Sinclair's men had been watching him for 2 years. Every business decision, every legal move, every relationship that might affect the property. If Sinclair knew there was a woman coming, a woman who would have legal standing on the property as his wife, he might move faster, hit harder before the arrangement could be formalized. So James had told no one, had ridden out alone at dawn, had taken Copper Canyon because it was faster. And Sinclair's men had been waiting in the canyon, which meant either Sinclair had known about the letters after all, or they had simply been watching the road and taken the opportunity when it presented itself. Either way, the woman he had written 10 pages of letters to, the woman he had asked for honesty and offered it in return, the woman who had written back with the kind of directness that had kept him at his writing desk past midnight more nights than he'd admit, that woman had walked into Copper Canyon with a traveling case and no protection and found him under a pile of rocks and had stayed. He looked at the ceiling. He thought about a letter he had written in September after her 3rd letter had arrived. "I find that I am looking forward to your replies in a way that has surprised me." He had crossed that sentence out and written it again 3 times before deciding to send it, which was not something he did. He was not a man who crossed things out. Outside, somewhere above the creek, a bird was beginning. The woman in the chair slept on. Dada. In the traveling case, the one she'd used as a lever to free his leg from the rock, its side panels now scraped and dented, there was a small object he could see from the cot, half fallen from the inner pocket where it had been jostled loose in the chaos of the canyon. A brass music box no larger than a man's fist. The kind that sat on a parlor table and played 8 bars of something sweet when you lifted the lid. It was not her music box. He knew it because it had been in his coat pocket since the morning. He always carried it when he wrote a habit, a superstition, the kind of thing a man does for years without fully understanding why. His father had given it to him the summer before the war, the summer James had turned 16, and his father had ridden out to check the south fence and come back with the kind of look on his face that meant he'd made a decision. "This will be yours someday," his father had said, setting the box on the table. "Everything will be yours someday. I want you to understand what that means. It doesn't mean wealth, James. It means responsibility. It means the people who work this land and the families that depend on it and the neighbors who built what they have beside you. It means all of it, not just the acres." He had kept the box in his coat pocket every day since his father died. It must have fallen from his coat in the canyon, and she must have picked it up with the other contents of the case when she'd gathered everything together. He could see the lid from the cot, and on the lid, in the small engraved letters his father had ordered from a craftsman in Tucson, J. From Father, 1861. She didn't know what it was. She had carried it through the canyon and into this cabin without knowing she was carrying the thing that had been in his coat every day for 9 years. He closed his eyes and lay still and listened to the creek. Nora woke to full morning light. For a moment, she didn't know where she was. A moment of pure blank disorientation that she associated with the worst periods of the war when she'd been working 20-hour shifts and sleeping in field tents and waking up never quite certain what state she was in or what year it was. Then she heard the creak and she smelled the cold ash of the fire and she remembered. She opened her eyes. Cole Delaney, she was still calling him that in her mind, for reasons she would examine later, was awake. He was lying on the cot with his head turned toward the door, and his eyes open in the particular stillness of someone who had been awake for a while and had been doing something with that time. "You heard something," she said. She said it the way she'd have said, "Your color is better matter of fact, not a question." He looked at her. "You wake up fast. My mother always said I slept like a soldier, one ear open." She stood, rolled her neck, and crossed to check his forehead with the back of her hand. He didn't flinch from the touch, which told her something. "What did you hear?" "Nothing yet," he said. "That's what worries me." "Explain that." "Men who are searching make noise when they're moving. When they stop moving—" He shifted slightly on the cot and his jaw tightened with the effort of it. "It means they've settled somewhere to wait." Nora thought about the riders on the ridge, the way they'd worked back and forth and then gone quiet. So they may have found the cabin and decided to watch it rather than approach it. "That's what I'd do," he said. "Then we have a problem." "We have several," he said. "The first one is that I can't walk." "No." "The second is that I have no weapon." Nora went to her traveling case. She opened it and went through the contents with the practiced efficiency of someone taking field inventory. Spare dress wrapped clean. Medical kit intact. A small notebook. The brass music box, which she moved aside without comment. A folding knife her late husband had given her the summer before he shipped out with the words, "The world is not St. Louis. Nora, keep this close." She set the knife on the cot beside him. He looked at it, then at her. "That's a paring knife." "It's sharp," she said. Something crossed his face that in different circumstances would have been a real smile. "You are a practical woman. I'm a surviving woman. There's a difference." She turned back to the case. "We need to move before they decide that watching is less efficient than coming down. I can't ride hard with this leg." "I'm not suggesting hard. I'm suggesting quiet and careful. And I'm suggesting now before the sun gets any higher." She paused. "You said there was a homestead 3 miles east. Can we get there?" He was quiet for a moment. That same quality of thinking she'd noticed before, deliberate, working through variables in sequence. "There's a way around the base of the ridge," he said. "Stays low, comes out behind the eastern fence line of—" He stopped. "Of where?" Nora asked. A pause that lasted 1 beat too long. "Of a property I know," he said. "There are people there who can help." She studied him. He met her eyes without flinching. She had learned from the war that what a man chose not to say at moments like this was usually the most important information he had. She filed it and left it alone. All right, she said. Tell me the way and I'll get us there. Then, getting him back on the horse was if anything harder than the first time. His leg had stiffened in the night. The break was clean, but the swelling had tightened everything around it, and moving the joint at all produced a response that she could feel through his arm, where she had her hands braced. He didn't make a sound. She had stopped being surprised by that. He had the kind of stubbornness she recognized from the war, not the stubborn of a man who was proving something, but the stubborn of a man who had spent years being the one other people depended on and had simply decided that certain sounds weren't his to make. On three, she said. On three, he agreed. She counted. He made it up white as new canvas breathing through his nose in the careful way of someone managing pain by arithmetic, and she got his broken leg settled free of the stirrup and took the reins and said, I'm going to walk beside you. If the ground gets rough, we slow down. You don't give a man many choices, he said. You're not in a position to want many choices, she told him. Let's go. They made it perhaps 3/4 of a mile before the trouble came. It didn't come from the ridge. That was the thing she hadn't anticipated. She'd been watching, up-tracking the high ground, listening for movement on the ridge line. The trouble came from below, from the creek path itself, from around a bend in the canyon wall. She hadn't been able to see, past two riders coming toward them at a walk unhurried, the particular pace of men who already knew where they were going. Nora stopped. She felt Cole's hand close on the saddle horn. Keep walking, he said low and even. Don't stop. Don't look directly at them. I see two, she said just as quietly. There's a third coming up behind us. Don't look. She didn't look. She kept walking, kept her hand on the horse's neck, kept her face pointed east, and she breathed and counted her own steps and measured the distance between herself and the two riders ahead as it closed with the patient, unhurried certainty of men who had already decided how this was going to go. The rider on the left was large, heavy through the shoulders, with a flat-brimmed hat pulled low and a rifle across his saddle that he wasn't pointing at anyone yet, but could point at anyone in approximately 2 seconds. Morning, he said. Not a greeting, a declaration of position. Morning, Nora said. The man's eyes moved from her to Cole, traveled over him slowly. The bandaged head, the leg resting free of the stirrup, the careful, contained posture of a man who was in considerable pain and intended not to show it. Your man have an accident. Fell from his horse, Nora said. We're trying to get him to a doctor. That right, Baseka, the parent said. Not a question. Which doctor? Nearest one. I was told there's one in Dusty Creek. Dusty Creek's west, the man said. You're heading east. The silence after that had edges. Nora kept her hand on the horse's neck and thought very quickly. She thought about the knife in Cole's coat pocket, which was too small to matter against 3 rifles. She thought about the third rider behind her, whose position she was calculating from the angle of his shadow on the path. She thought about a ward sergeant at Chancellorsville who had told her the night before the battle that the trick with men who meant you harm was to give them a story that was more useful to them than whatever they'd planned. I beg your pardon, she said in the precise voice of a woman gently correcting a social error. I was told by the station agent in Dusty Creek that Dr. Hennessy's homestead lies east of the creek path. His wife was a trained nurse during the war. I intend to get my husband there, she paused. I would be grateful if you'd let us pass. There was no Dr. Hennessy. She didn't know if there was a homestead east of the creek path, but she said it the way her mother had taught her to say things that needed to be true, not as a lie, but as a fact that simply hadn't happened yet. The two riders looked at each other. You got a name, the one on the left said to Cole. I do, Cole said. A pause. Well, Harlan Webb, Cole said. Cattle buyer out of Tucson. My wife and I were coming through the canyon yesterday when my horse spooked on the trail. I'd be grateful for the same courtesy you'd extend to any traveling man. The rider on the right shifted in his saddle. Something in his posture had changed, not convinced but uncertain. Uncertain was something to work with. We're looking for a man, the rider on the left said. Came through this canyon yesterday morning. Big man, dark hair, riding a gray. His eyes moved briefly to the gray horse, to Cole on top of it. I can't help you there, Nora said pleasantly. We had enough trouble of our own yesterday to be paying attention to other travelers. She gestured with a kind of apologetic helplessness at Cole's bandaged head. Another long silence. Then the rider on the left made a small movement with his chin, a signal to the man behind her, and pulled his horse to the side of the path. Safe travels, he said. The words did not match his tone. Thank you kindly, Nora said. She walked forward, One step, then another, and then another, keeping her hand on the horse's neck and her eyes on the path ahead, and she did not look back, and she did not change her pace, and she counted her own steps under her breath until the sound of the riders behind her faded around the bend in the canyon wall. Then she breathed. Harlan Webb, she said quietly. First name that came to me, Cole said. It worked. This time, he said. His voice had an edge she hadn't heard in it before. They'll compare notes. When they realize there's no Harlan Webb in any cattle buyer's registry, they'll come back with more men and less patience. Then we need to move faster. Nora. He said her name in a way that stopped her feet. She looked up at him. His dark eyes were direct and steady, and carrying something she recognized as the weight of a decision a man had been working toward and had finally arrived at. There's something I need to tell you, he said. Tell me while we walk. We're not stopping. He was quiet for a moment. The creek ran alongside them, cold and clear over flat stones, and above the canyon walls, the sky was the hard, brilliant blue of a September morning in the desert. The property I'm taking us to, he said, it's not a neighboring homestead. What is it? Another pause. It's Ashford Ridge Ranch. Nora's feet kept moving for 3 steps on their own momentum, carrying her forward while her mind caught up with what he'd said. Then she stopped. She turned around. She looked up at him, at the dark eyes and the set jaw and the careful, steady expression of a man who had been holding something and had finally set it down. She looked at the gray horse. She looked at the coat, the quality of the boots, the calloused hands. She thought about this brass music box with J.A. from Father 1861 engraved on the lid. She said nothing for a long time. You were coming to the station, she said finally. That's why you were in the canyon. Yes, they knew I was coming. A pause. They knew about the letters. I don't know how I told no one, but yes, they must have. He held her gaze without looking away. They'd been looking for a reason to move against me for 2 years. If they learned I was acquiring a partner, someone with legal standing on the property, it may have pushed their hand. So they tried to kill you? Yes. And now they're looking for you? Yes. And your ranch is under threat if they believe you're dead or incapacitated? Yes. His voice was level, but she could hear what was underneath it. I have men there. Good men. But if Sinclair moves on the property before I can show myself alive, we need to get you there, Nora said. Nora, you lied to me about your name, she said. Her voice was even. You let me believe you were a stranger when you'd known who I was from the moment I mentioned Ashford Ridge. She paused. We will discuss that later. Right now, your ranch is in danger, and the men looking for you are going to figure out they've been lied to within the hour. She picked up the reins and started walking east. So we moved, she said. And you tell me everything I need to know about what I'm walking into, every enemy, every name, every piece of land they want, and every reason they want it. Do you understand me? He looked at her from the saddle with those dark eyes, and whatever he saw in her face made something in him settle. Not relax, not quite, but settle. The way a man settles when he's been carrying something a long time and has finally found somewhere to put it down. I understand you, he said. Then start talking, she said, and he talked. You do. End of part 1. Word count, 600 words. Part 2, the road. He talked. He told her about Ward Sinclair, who had arrived in the Arizona Territory 3 years ago with money from Chicago Railroad interests and a plan that was simple in the way that vicious things are simple. Acquire every significant piece of land between the canyon and the river before the Southern Pacific Survey was made public, then sell the right-of-way back to the railroad at 10 times its worth. He told her about the survey. The Southern Pacific had commissioned it the previous winter, a detailed assessment of possible routes through the territory completed by a firm out of San Francisco and filed with the railroad's legal office. He knew about it because his father had been one of the original landowners the railroad had approached when the first surveys were done 15 years ago. His father had negotiated an informal understanding, nothing legally binding, but recorded in correspondence that Ashford Ridge would have the right to negotiate its own terms with the railroad when the time came. That correspondence was in the brass music box. He had not told Nora that yet. The railroad route, he said from the saddle as they moved along the base of the ridge, it runs directly through the south quarter of Ashford Ridge. The right-of-way figure the railroad has offered is substantial. Substantial enough that Sinclair has been willing to do things that can't be undone to get his hands on it. He needs your property specifically, Nora said, not just adjacent land. Without mine, the route has to divert 17 miles north through the Moreno family's land. The grade is worse, and the construction cost doubles. He can't complete the scheme without Ashford Ridge. And you've been refusing to sell for 2 years. What's he done in those 2 years? She was thinking of him as James, now adjusting, was quiet for a moment. He bought up the Haskell water rights, which gave him leverage over 3 smaller homesteads that depend on that creek. 2 of them sold under pressure they didn't ask for and couldn't afford to resist. The Brock family, the Tanaka family. He paused. Ned Tanaka was my father's closest neighbor. His family has been farming that land for 20 years. Nora filed the names. Who else? There's a judge in Prescott. His name is Hartwell. Sinclair has been paying him. I have letters that prove it, or I did before this morning. They're in the ranch house. He paused. And there's a railroad agent in Tucson who's been falsifying the survey documents. The original survey puts the right-of-way through the north edge of my land with a 10-year negotiation window. The version Sinclair has been using puts the southern quarter under eminent domain. He stopped. It's a forgery. I've seen both versions. But without the original survey documents, where are the originals? A silence. James. He looked at her. The corner of his mouth moved at almost a wince, almost something else. In my coat, he said, inside the music box. Nora was quiet for a long moment. She thought about the music box in her traveling case jostled free from his coat pocket in the canyon. She thought about the engraving, J.A. from Father 1861. Your father's correspondence with the railroad, she said. Yes, and the original survey. Folded and sealed in the base, the box has a false bottom. He paused. My father built it that way. He didn't trust safes. Nora looked at the path ahead and did not say anything for a moment. She was thinking about the riders on the ridge last night, searching methodically in the dark, and about the 3 men on the creek path this morning, and about the way they had described the man they were looking for, big man, dark hair, riding a gray. They had known who they were looking for. They had not known about the box. They had not apparently found it in the canyon, which meant the most important documents in this fight were currently in her traveling case, jostled up against a spare dress and her medical kit. All right, she said. All right. All right meaning I understand the situation. All right meaning we have more to work with than I thought. She adjusted her grip on the reins. You said you have good men at the ranch. Tell me about them. Walt Keegan. He's been my foreman since my father died. James paused. He's the most reliable man I've ever known. He'll have held the property together. But if Sinclair moves on the ranch officially with a legal document from Judge Hartwell, Walt won't be able to resist it without me there to counter it. Are there neighbors who would stand with you? Rafael Moreno. His family has the eastern spread. They've been there longer than the Ashfords. He's lost 2 grazing contracts to Sinclair's interference. He has reason, James thought. Henry Brock, the old man who lost the Brock homestead. He moved into town, but he knows where the documents are buried. He was present when the original railroad correspondence was signed. He paused. And there's Pete Haskell, the station agent. Yes. A long pause. He knew what was in that canyon this morning, didn't he? It wasn't a question. Nora didn't answer immediately. She thought about Haskell's careful eyes and his too long hesitation and the way he had told her reluctantly to take the longer road. He told me to go the other way, she said. Not directly, but he told me. James was quiet. He was frightened, Nora said. That's not the same as complicit. No, James said, it's not. They walked in silence for a moment. The ridge was falling away to their left, now the path beginning to open up into the broader valley floor. Ahead through the scrub oak and mesquite, she could see the beginnings of a fence line. Then she smelled the smoke. She stopped. Beside her, she felt James go rigid in the saddle, not the gradual stiffening of pain, but the immediate total stillness of a man whose body has understood something before his mind has caught up with it. That's coming from the south pasture, he said. His voice had changed, harder, stripped down to function the way a person's voice changes when the time for thinking is over. They fired the grass to drive the cattle, to pull Walt's men away from the house. He was already calculating. If Walt takes the crew south to handle the fire, the house is open. How far are we? Half a mile. Can you ride hard? A beat. I have to. She looked up at him. She saw the set of his jaw, the controlled grip of his hand on the saddle horn, the line of white around his mouth where the pain was pressed back. Then she grabbed the saddle, put her foot in the stirrup below his good leg, and swung up behind him. Then ride, she said. Ma'am. They came through the ranch gate at a hard gallop. The gate was standing open, not broken, not forced, but open the way a gate stands when someone has unlocked it from inside and walked away. someone who was supposed to be on James's side of the fence. Nora felt him register. It felt the breath he took and didn't release. The yard was not quiet. There were men in it, not strangers she could tell from the way James's body responded, a fractional release of tension. His men. But two of them were standing near the main house with the particular posture of people who had received conflicting instructions and weren't sure which set to follow. The third man was near the barn door, and he turned at the sound of hoofbeats with a rifle already in his hands. He was a lean man, somewhere in his 60s, with the posture of someone who had never once in his life permitted himself to slump. He had the face of a man who had seen a great deal of hard country and arrived at a settled opinion about most of it. He saw James and something moved through his face, a movement that Nora, who had seen many kinds of faces at many kinds of moments, understood immediately. It was the way a man looks when something he had already begun quietly to accept as loss turns out to still be there. "Boss," Walt Keegan said, just the one word, but it carried everything. "Walt?" James pulled the horse up and got down badly. Nora steadied his arm through the last foot of it, and he stood on his good leg and didn't fall, which took everything he had. "Talk to me. How bad?" "Bad enough." Walt was already scanning the yard, the gate, the south horizon, where the smoke was still rising. Sinclair's men came at first light, 6 of them, said they had a legal document, an eminent domain order, signed by Judge Hartwell. "I know it's fraudulent, but 3 of the boys didn't know that, and Sinclair's lawyer talked fast." His jaw tightened. "Toby Marsh opened the gate. He's been sick about it since. Said the lawyer convinced him it was legitimate. Where are Sinclair's men now?" "2 stayed at the gate." Walt glanced at it. "You must have ridden right past them. They probably didn't recognize you with the bandage. They will once they compare notes with the men from the canyon." James looked at Nora. She was already off the horse, her traveling case in her hand, working through the yard toward the house. "Walt, this is Nora Calloway." Walt looked at her. "She's the reason I'm alive," James said, "and she has full standing here. Treat her accordingly." Walt turned his assessment on Nora with the unguarded directness of a man who had long since stopped wasting time on social convention. What he saw apparently satisfied him because he gave a single short nod. "Ma'am." "Mr. Keegan," Nora said, "how many men do you have who are certain as in loyal, certain as in they will not open any more gates?" Walt almost smiled. 5, maybe 6. "And Sinclair has how many here?" 6 at the property. More in town from what I hear." "Then we need the sheriff," Nora said. She looked at James. "You said the documents are in the house." "In my office, the desk, but the music box," she said. She set her traveling case on the porch step, opened it, and lifted out the brass box. She held it up for a moment so he could see it. James stared at it, then at her. "You knew." "I worked it out on the creek path, the engraving." She looked at him steadily. "You should have told me about the documents before we left the cabin." "Yes," he said, "I should have. We'll discuss that later." She tucked the box under her arm. "There are also documents in your desk. You said the letters between Sinclair and Judge Hartwell." "Yes, in the locked drawer. The key is taped under the center." "I'll find it." She was already at the door. "Walt, how far is the sheriff?" 3 miles. There's the rider. Send your fastest man now. Tell him to bring the sheriff and both deputies and to tell them we have documents that prove conspiracy to commit murder and land fraud and a judge on the payroll." She paused at the door. "Tell him to say it exactly like that." Walt looked at James. James looked at Nora's retreating back with an expression that Walt Keegan, who had known James Ashford for most of the man's life, had never seen on him before. "Do what she says," James said. Walt barked an order. One of the hands broke from the fence at a run toward the stable. "That's it." The desk was locked. Nora tried the top drawer first, then ran her hand along the underside of each drawer, in the methodical way she'd developed over years of searching field supply crates for items that weren't where they were supposed to be. She found the key taped to the bottom of the center drawer, small and flat and brass, easy to miss. She unlocked the desk. The letters were there, a bundle of them, bound with cord, with a surveyor's envelope folded beneath. She went through them quickly, not reading, just cataloging. Letters between Sinclair and Hartwell. The altered eminent domain document with 3 lines rewritten in a different hand than the one that had signed the bottom. A payment ledger with dates and figures. She knew what a forged document looked like. During the war, she had been asked twice to sign documentation she knew to be false records altered to conceal supply theft. She had refused both times, and both times she had noted the tells. The pressure difference in the ink where the original had been scraped. The slight misalignment of re-inked letters, the way a document's surface changed texture where it had been worked. This document had all three. She wrapped everything in the surveyor's envelope, along with the contents of the music box, the original survey documents, and the railroad correspondence sealed in a waxed paper folder that had been fitted into the false bottom with the care of a man who had built it to last. She pressed the package flat and tucked it inside her medical kit. She was back outside in less than 5 minutes. James was still in the yard, standing on his good leg with Walt at his shoulder, directing his men with the focused efficiency of a man who knew exactly what each variable in this yard could be depended on for. He looked at her when she came through the door, and the question was already in his face. "I have them," she said. Something moved through him. Relief, but carrying more weight than relief, the way a man looks when something he had been holding himself together around is finally actually in safe hands. "Walt," Nora said, "Sinclair's men at the gate, they're going to realize something's wrong when the riders from the canyon report in. How long do we have?" Hour, maybe less. "And the sheriff?" "Best case 40 minutes. "The documents are safe," Nora said. "We hold the yard. Don't give Sinclair's men a reason to take a legal action they can point to later. No shots fired, no confrontation. We start. If they come to the gate, we give them nothing." She looked at James. "The Moreno family. You said Rafael Moreno would stand with you. Can you get word to him?" "Moreno's spread is 4 miles east. If I send Tommy..." "Send Tommy to Nora said, "and send someone to Henry Brock in town. Tell him what's happening. Tell him we have the original documents and we need him ready to testify that they're genuine." She paused. "He was present when the railroad correspondence was signed, you said." "He was." "Then his testimony establishes the chain of custody. The forgery becomes provable." She looked at the smoke still rising from the south pasture. "And get your men on that grass fire before it reaches the fence posts." Walt Keegan, who was not a man who expressed opinions he hadn't earned the right to have, looked at James Ashford with the expression of someone making a significant revision. James looked back at him with the expression of a man who understood exactly what Walt was thinking and was not, at this particular moment, prepared to disagree. "Do it," James said. Ward Sinclair arrived at the ranch gate 40 minutes later. He rode in with 4 men and his lawyer, a slight man named Aldous, with the creased look of someone who had arrived from the east expecting a different kind of work, and he was not what Nora had expected. She had built a picture of Sinclair from James's account on the creek path, a large man heavy with the assurance of someone who had never been told no in a room that mattered. What rode through the gate was lean, well-dressed, with a pleasant face and the kind of easy confidence that comes not from aggression, but from the accumulated experience of getting what you want through patience and leverage. He looked at the yard, at the men near the barn, at James standing at the porch step with Walt behind him, with the expression of a man reviewing a situation he'd already mapped. Then his gaze found Nora and he recalibrated. She could see him do it. The slight pause, the reassessment, the filing of information she hadn't intended to give him yet. She stood still and let him look. "Carter," he said to James. Not James a slip or a deliberate choice. He corrected it smoothly. "Ashford, you're alive. I heard there was trouble in the canyon yesterday. I was concerned." "Were you?" James said. Sinclair's pleasant expression didn't shift. "Rockslide, I was told. Terrible thing." His eyes moved back to Nora. "Who's this?" "My wife," James said. The word landed in the yard like a stone in still water. Nora did not move. She stood beside James with her hands at her sides and her face composed into the expression she had used when delivering difficult information to hospital administrators who did not want to hear it, attentive, measured, entirely undisturbed. Sinclair smiled. "I wasn't aware you'd married Ashford." "There are many things you're not aware of," James said, "including the fact that the document your lawyer is carrying is a forgery." Aldous stiffened. Sinclair's smile held but thinned at the edges. "That's a significant accusation." "I have the original," James said, "and the correspondence between you and Judge Hartwell that explains how the revision was arranged." He paused. "My rider left for the sheriff's office 30 minutes ago." A small change moved across Sinclair's face, a fractional stillness, a recalculation. He looked at Nora, at the medical kit she was carrying. He was intelligent enough to arrive at the right answer. "Give me the documents," he said to her. Pleasantly, the way a man says, "Pass the salt." "I beg your pardon," Nora said. "Whatever you're carrying." He smiled again. "Hand it over and I'll see to it that the unpleasantness from yesterday is settled quietly and Mr. Ashford's medical expenses are covered. Everyone goes home. No need for the sheriff to make a trip." "You're offering to bribe me," Nora said. I'm offering a practical resolution. Nora looked at him for a moment. She thought about a man under rocks in a canyon with a pulse thin as a thread. She thought about the night she'd spent counting his breaths, waiting to find out if the next one would come. She thought about the riders on the ridge methodically searching. No, she said. Sinclair's pleasantness finally yielded not dramatically, not with anger, but with the particular absence that shows when a mask is removed rather than changed. What was underneath it was not pleasant at all. Mrs. Ashford, he said, using the name with a deliberate weight, you don't understand what you've stepped into. I understand it clearly, Nora said. You had my husband ambushed in a canyon and left for dead because you want his land and the railroad right-of-way. You bribed a federal judge to produce a fraudulent eminent domain order. When that wasn't sufficient, you sent men to his property to intimidate his workers and drive his cattle. She kept her voice even and her eyes on his. What I am involved in, Mr. Sinclair, is the law, which you appear to have forgotten applies to you as well as to everyone else. The yard was absolutely still. Walt Keegan, standing 3 feet to her left, said nothing, but she heard him exhale. Sinclair looked at her for a long time with eyes that had entirely stopped pretending. Then he looked at his men, then at James. This isn't finished, he said. No, James said, but it will be. Sinclair pulled his horse around and rode out through the gate. His men followed. Aldous scrambled after them with the look of a man who had signed onto a job and was only now reading the full terms. The gate stood open behind them. Got him. The next 2 hours were the kind that leave marks. Walt organized the men. James, who could not ride and could barely stand, but who was not going to let either of those facts alter what he could direct, worked from the porch step with the focused economy of a man who had run this operation for 9 years and knew every variable in it. He sent 3 hands to the south fence for the grass fire. He sent 2 to the high ground above the ridge to watch Sinclair's likely return routes. He sent 1 rider to the Moreno spread and another into town for Henry Brock. He did all of it in the voice of a man in considerable pain who had decided that pain was not going to be relevant. Nora changed his bandages. She did it on the porch step because he wouldn't go inside while his men were working, and she did it with the efficient brevity she applied to everything, and they didn't speak much while she worked. Then she said, "The word you used when Sinclair asked who I was." James was quiet for a moment. "I know what you said," she said. "We're not married." "No," he said, "we're not." She tied off the last bandage. "It was tactically sound," she said. "A married man with a documented spouse has stronger standing in a property dispute. You've known that since the beginning. It was part of why you wrote to the agency in the first place." "Yes," he said. "So I need to know," Nora said, "whether what you said to Sinclair was strategy or something else." She looked at him. He looked back at her, and she could see him working through something, not a decision exactly, more like a man who had finally stopped finding reasons to delay an honest answer. "Something else," he said. She was quiet. "I have not been able to think clearly since you walked up out of that canyon," he said. "I want to be honest with you about that, because you asked me once in a letter if I was a man who kept his word, and I told you I was, and I intend to prove it." He paused. "So something else." The sounds of the ranch moved around them. Men calling cattle distant and unsettled, the smoke from the south pasture thinning as the hands got the fire under control. Nora looked out at the yard and didn't speak for a moment. "You pulled me out from under those rocks," he said. "You set my leg and fought my fever and sat up all night in the dark to make sure I was still breathing. You faced down 3 riders on a creek path with a paring knife in your pocket and nothing but nerve and good sense." He stopped. "I wrote those letters for a practical reason. I told myself that was all it was. But I have never in my life written 12 pages to a stranger and found myself at my desk past midnight because I wanted to finish what I was saying." Nora said nothing. "You don't have to answer that," he said. "I'm not asking you for anything right now. I'm just not going to lie to you again by pretending it was only strategy." She stood up. She brushed the dust from her skirt with both hands and looked out at the yard where his men were working, her hands still wrapped in cloth from the canyon, her dress that she'd put on in St. Louis 3 days ago, now irreparably worn. "My late husband used to say," she said, "that the fastest way to know a person's character was to watch what they did when things went badly wrong." She looked at him. "Your character is not in question." She went inside to put the documents somewhere safer than the medical kit. Behind her, James Ashford sat on the step of his own porch and felt something shift in his chest. Not a resolution exactly, but the beginning of one. The sheriff arrived in just under an hour. His name was Cal Draper, A compact, weathered man in his mid-50s with the resigned expression of someone whose afternoon had just become significantly more complicated. He had two deputies and had clearly ridden hard. His horse was showing it. He looked at the smoke still fading from the south pasture and then looked at the assembled yardmen at the fence. James on the porch step, Nora standing in the doorway with a package of documents, with the expression of a man adding up a sum he already suspected the total of. Ashford, he said. Draper, James said. Draper looked at Nora. Who's this? Nora Calloway, Nora said. I arrived in Dusty Creek yesterday afternoon. I found Mr. Ashford in Copper Canyon and have been with him since. She came down the porch steps. I have documents I need you to look at. She spread them into the porch railing. The original survey, the railroad correspondence, the forged eminent domain order and its comparison with the letter from Hartwell that confirmed the alteration, the payment ledger. Draper went through them with the careful attention of a man who understood what he was looking at. Where'd you get these? The letters in the ledger were in Mr. Ashford's desk. He's been keeping them for the better part of a year as evidence. Nora indicated the wax folder. The original survey and the railroad correspondence were in his possession when he was ambushed yesterday. They document the forged right-of-way and establish that the document Sinclair has been using is not the original. Draper picked up the altered eminent domain order. He looked at Walt. This is the same document Sinclair's lawyer showed you this morning. Same seal, Walt said. Different words in sections 2 and 3. I noticed it, but I didn't have the original to compare. Draper set it down. He looked at Nora with the measured assessment of a man recalibrating. You're the one who found all this. I'm the one who knew where to look, Nora said. Mr. Ashford showed me. She paused. Are you willing to give formal testimony, Mrs.? He glanced at James. Miss Calloway, Nora said. We're not married. Mr. Ashford introduced me as his wife this morning during a confrontation with Sinclair. It was tactically appropriate at the time. Something crossed James's face. Walt Keegan's mouth moved in a way that was not quite a smile. Are you willing to give formal testimony? Draper said again. A written statement and whatever else the law requires, Nora said. I watched those men ambush Mr. Ashford in Copper Canyon yesterday morning. I will say so under oath. She paused. I also believe Pete Haskell at the Dusty Creek station knows more than he said. He warned me obliquely not to take the canyon path. I believe he's aware of what Sinclair's men were doing on that road. Draper wrote that down. If these documents are what they appear to be, he said, we're looking at conspiracy to commit murder fraud against a federal officer and corruption of a judicial appointment. That's a federal matter, not just county. He closed his notebook. I'm going to send a telegram to the U.S. Marshal's office in Prescott. Tonight, James asked. Tonight. Draper looked at him. Where's Sinclair now? He was at the gate 40 minutes ago. He rode out when I told him we had the documents. James paused. He won't run. He's not the kind of man who accepts losing without making the other side pay for it first. He'll come back tonight. Draper thought about that. He looked at the yard, the fence the men positioned at the gate. How many men can you legally deputize? Nora asked. Everyone in the yard looked at her. For tonight, she said. If Sinclair moves against the property, you need numbers and you need legal authority. How many men can you deputize in an emergency? As many as I need in a genuine threat situation. Then deputize Mr. Ashford's men. Give them legal standing to defend this property. She looked at James. Oh, the Moreno family and Henry Brock, did you reach them? Moreno's men are coming. Brock's in town, but he'll come if we ask. Ask, Nora said. Sinclair has been squeezing the Morenos for 2 years. If he loses tonight, they're free. They have as much reason to be here as anyone. She paused, not just as witnesses, as people who stand. Walt looked at James with the expression of a man evaluating a proposal and finding it against his expectations sound. She's right, Walt said. She's right, James agreed. He looked at Nora across the yard, and the late afternoon light was falling across the porch in the particular way of September in the desert, warm and amber and utterly honest, and in it he could see her exactly as she was practical, precise, bloodied about the hands worn at the hem, entirely undefeated. All right, he said. We do it her way. Sundown brought the Moreno family. Rafael Moreno was 51 years old and had 3 sons, and had watched Ward Sinclair's men drive 100 of his cattle off his grazing land over 2 years using a fraudulent water claim. He arrived at the Ashford Ridge Gate with his sons and 4 ranch hands, and the expression of a man who had been waiting a long time for a night where fighting back was not just possible but legal. He shook James's hand at the gate. Then he turned and looked at Nora with the frank, direct assessment of a man who had spent his life reading people accurately because inaccuracy was expensive. "You're the woman from St. Louis," he said. "Walt says you're the one who found James in the canyon." "I'm the one who happened to be there," Nora said. Raphael looked at her for a moment longer. "Walt also says you organized the defense of this yard this afternoon and told the sheriff how to do his job." "I made some suggestions." Rafael Moreno smiled not broadly but genuinely, the smile of a man who had arrived expecting competence and found something more. "You are not what I expected," he said, from a mail-order bride. "I'm not a mail-order bride," Nora said. "I'm a woman who answered a letter." Raphael looked at James. James was watching Nora with the same expression he'd had all afternoon, the expression of a man who had thought he understood what he was looking at and keeps discovering new depth. "Buena suerte," Raphael said to him quietly and went to find Walt. "Yeah." Henry Brock arrived at 7:30. He was a compact man in his early 70s, with the slightly stunned expression of someone who had been called back into something he thought was finished. He had lost his homestead to Sinclair 8 months ago, not through outright theft, but through a complex of legal pressures and water rights maneuvers that had made the property untenable. He had moved into Dusty Creek Town and taken a room above the hardware store, and he had been living there in the particular quiet of a man who has been defeated and is trying to decide what to do with that. He arrived at Ashford Ridge with a tin box under his arm. "I kept copies," he said to James at the gate. His voice was steady, but his hands were not. "Of everything. The original correspondence with the railroad. The statement I gave when the survey was filed. I kept them because I thought—" He stopped. "I thought someday someone would need them." James took the tin box. He looked at it for a moment. "Someday is tonight, Henry," he said. Henry Brock looked at James, then he looked at the assembled yard, Moreno's men at the fence, Draper's deputies near the gate, while organizing the positions with the quiet authority of a man who had done this kind of work before. He looked at Nora, who was at the near corner of the porch with her medical kit and the night air doing something cool and final to everything around them. "Who's she?" he asked Walt quietly. "The woman who saved his life," Walt said, and then kept saving it. Henry Brock looked at Nora for a long moment. Then he nodded once with the weight of a man who has been waiting for something and is not entirely surprised by what it turned out to be. "Good," he said simply, and went inside to tell his story to the sheriff. Sinclair's men came at 10 o'clock. They came quiet, which was what James had predicted. No torches, no noise, just 8 riders spreading across the approach to the property in the deliberate pattern of a planned assault coming from 3 directions to split the defense. They had studied the ranch's layout. They knew where the gate was weak and where the fence line could be breached. They had not anticipated Rafael Moreno's 3 sons on the north fence deputized and waiting. They had not anticipated the Moreno hands on the east approach. They had not anticipated Nora Calloway, who had spent the late afternoon doing something in the tool shed with materials that Walt had initially regarded with deep skepticism and that she had declined to explain until she was ready. She had found in the shed a supply of dried herb bundles, sage and cedar, the kind ranchers kept for various purposes, and the pitch pine offcuts from the last fence repair. Combined in the right proportions and wrapped in cloth with a long wick, they burned slow and produced a smoke that was dense low and in an enclosed space or a narrow approach, profoundly disorienting. She had read about the technique in a field medicine text on the management of crowd situations, and she had spent the afternoon making 12 bundles and positioning them along the north fence line and the gap between the canyon wall and the eastern approach where the riders would have to funnel. Walt had looked at the bundles and said, "That's not a weapon." "It's a disruption," Nora said. "Disruption doesn't have to be a weapon to work." When the first rider reached the north fence, she lit the first bundle. The smoke rolled low and fast in the September night wind, spreading across the approach before the riders could pull back. Horses encountering sudden dense smoke and darkness do what horses always do. They communicate their opinions about the situation loudly and physically and without reference to the instructions of their riders. The approach collapsed into noise and confusion, and before it could reorganize itself, the Moreno boys stepped out of the dark with deputized authority and rifles that had been in their families for 20 years. And the Moreno hands came up from the east, and Sheriff Draper came through the main gate with both deputies. What had been planned as a quiet assault on a property believed to be lightly defended became something else entirely. By midnight, 7 of Sinclair's riders were in custody. Ward Sinclair himself was not among them. Walt found the horse at the south fence at 12:30, saddled riderless reins trailing in the dark. The south fence opened onto open desert that ran 30 miles before it hit the next piece of settled land. He ran on foot, Walt said. He can't go far, Draper said. Desert's open country past the South Ridge. No water for 12 miles. He knows these hills, James said. He's been surveying them for 2 years. He paused. So have we. And we have more men. He looked out at the desert, at the dark, at the stars that came out in numbers you only saw in country this open. In the morning, we'll find him in the morning. He was quiet for a moment. Is everyone accounted for? He asked Walt. Everyone, Walt said. He looked sideways at James, including Miss Calloway. James looked toward the house. Nora was on the porch step with Rafael Moreno's youngest son, a boy of about 14 who had apparently attached himself to her sometime around the smoke bundles and had not detached since. They were talking about something in the lamp light. The boy's face animated Nora, listening with the full patient attention she gave to everything. James stood in the dark and watched. He thought about a letter written on a Tuesday evening in April, after her fourth letter had arrived. He had read it twice and then sat for 20 minutes not writing anything, which was unusual for him. He thought about the words she'd used in that letter partnership and the way she'd used it not as a legal formality, but as something she actually meant, as a description of what she was offering and what she expected in return. He thought about a woman who had found him under rocks and decided without knowing anything else about him that a person still breathing was worth her effort. Walt, he said. Boss? James watched the lamplight fall across the porch where Nora was talking to the boy, her hands animated now to explaining something. In the morning, he said, when this is finished, I need to talk to her. Walt was quiet for a long moment. She called herself Miss Calloway, Walt said. When she corrected the sheriff, James went still. Thought you should know, Walt said. He walked back toward the fence line, leaving James standing alone at the gate in the dark. The stars were very bright over the desert. Somewhere south of the fence, a man named Ward Sinclair was running through the dark toward water that was 12 miles away, and by morning it would be finished, and James Ashford knew it and was glad of it. But that was morning and this was now. And now the ranch was standing and the documents were safe. And on the porch of the house, his father had built a woman who had come all the way from St. Louis on the word of a letter, was making a 14-year-old boy laugh in the lamplight. He began walking toward the step. Pass him. End of part 2. Word count, 6,400 words. Part 3, the ranch. Ward Sinclair was found at first light. Not running that was the thing nobody had anticipated. Pete Moreno, Rafael's eldest son, riding the South Ridge in the gray pre-dawn, with 2 of his brothers found Sinclair sitting with his back against a boulder, 2 miles past the south fence. His coat pulled around him, and his face carrying the expression of a man who had made a calculation in the dark and arrived at an answer he didn't particularly like. He had twisted his ankle badly in the first half mile. He could not have gone farther if he'd wanted to. He looked up at Pete Moreno and said, "Get the sheriff." That was all. Pete got the sheriff. Draper rode out with his deputies and came back with Sinclair. Between them and the yard of Ashford Ridge filled up again with the Moreno family and Henry Brock, and 4 ranch hands who had slept against the fence and woken up ready to see how the story ended. Nora was on the porch when they rode in. Sinclair looked at her as they passed. It was a specific kind of look, a man retracing his steps, working backward through his plan, looking for the exact moment where everything had gone wrong. She watched him arrive at it. The moment when the woman who was supposed to be a mail-order bride, sitting on a bench in Dusty Creek, had instead walked into a canyon, and every calculation he'd made had unraveled from that point forward. She did not feel satisfaction. She felt something more precise, the quiet rightness of a matter being resolved. She went inside to start the coffee. Bing! It was Aldous the lawyer who broke first. Sinclair, sitting in Draper's custody in the ranch house front room, with the documents spread on the table before him, kept his pleasant expression and said almost nothing. Even with the evidence in plain sight, he was a man who had built a careful structure around himself and knew how to shelter inside it. But Aldous, who had arrived from Chicago 18 months ago to handle Sinclair's legal work and had evidently not read the full job description carefully enough, looked at the documents, at the sheriff, at the faces of the people standing in and around the room, and began talking before Draper had finished his first question. He talked for over an hour. He talked about Judge Hartwell and the arrangement that had been agreed over a card game in a back room of the Prescott Hotel. He talked about the 2 men who had followed James into Copper Canyon with specific instructions that they would be paid triple if Ashford Ridge went on the market within 60 days. He talked about the railroad agent in Tucson who had been promised 8% of the final transaction. He talked about the Brock family and the Tanaka family and the water rights manipulations that had forced them out, and he talked about the clerk at the Territorial Land Office who had been substituting the forged survey for the original in the filing record. He talked about a man named Dalt Freeney who ran the correspondence agency in St. Louis. The room went very still. Nora, who had been standing near the window, turned around. "What about the correspondence agency?" Draper said. Aldous looked at the floor. He had the expression of a man paying a debt he hadn't chosen to take on, but had inherited by his proximity to the man who had. "Sinclair had a contact inside the agency," he said. "A clerk who passed information about new correspondence. When Miss Calloway's file was opened." He stopped. "Say it," Draper said. When she responded to Mr. Ashford's advertisement, Aldous said the clerk informed Sinclair. He knew there was a woman coming from St. Louis. He knew when. He knew the train. The room was absolutely quiet. Nora looked at Aldous steadily. She was aware of James at the edge of her peripheral vision going very still. "He tried to use that," she said. "Not a question." "There were instructions," Aldous said. He would not quite meet her eyes. "For a man in Dusty Creek before the ambush. Instructions that if Mr. Ashford survived the canyon—" He stopped again, swallowed. The woman from St. Louis was to be discouraged from proceeding to the ranch. "Discouraged," Nora said. "Those were the words." "Yes." "What did it mean in practice?" Aldous looked at the floor. "I don't know," he said. "I want to believe it meant turning her away, sending her back. But given He didn't finish. He didn't need to. James had gone very still in the particular way of a man receiving information that his body processes before his mind catches up to it, the kind of information that reconfigures things. Nora could feel it from across the room without looking directly at him. She was already following the thread. The station agent, Pete Haskell. The way he had hesitated when she'd said James's name, the look on his face when she'd told him she was James's intended, not surprise, not confusion. Something more like the look of a man who has just been handed a problem he'd been hoping wouldn't come up. The careful way he had mentioned the canyon. There's been trouble on that stretch. Riders, men nobody's putting their name to, not discouraging her directly, not saying don't go, just noting it, offering her the information and then watching her make the choice. At least take the road. Not the canyon path. It's longer, but it's safer. He had known. He had known what was in that canyon, and he had been instructed or paid or threatened to keep her away from it, and instead he had told her as clearly as his fear would allow him to take the safer road. She had not taken the safer road. "The station agent," she said. Her voice was steady. "Pete Haskell. He knew I was coming. He knew about the canyon." "Yes," Aldous said quietly. "He warned me," Nora said. "Not directly, but he told me to take the longer road." James spoke from across the room. "He went against Sinclair." "He went against Sinclair," Nora said. "And I didn't listen." She looked at James. He looked back at her, and in the space between them was everything that had happened in the past 2 days: the canyon, the fever, the riders on the ridge, Sinclair in the yard, the brass music box with its false bottom, and its 9 years of safekeeping. And underneath all of it, the thing that had been there from the beginning, the woman who had been exactly where Sinclair's men had wanted her to be, and had survived it not because she had been protected, but because she had been unstoppable. "Mr. Aldous," Nora said without looking away from James, "I'll need your testimony in writing. Every name, every instruction, the clerk at the agency, and the mess at the station, and exactly what Sinclair intended." She paused. "You'll come with me to the sheriff's office tomorrow morning and repeat it in front of Cal Draper. And if there's a federal hearing, you'll stand in front of a marshal and repeat it there." "Yes," Aldous said. "And Pete Haskell," she said. "He warned me about the canyon. Whatever he knew, whatever arrangement he'd been pressured into, he chose to do what he could manage. That matters." She paused. "You'll say so on paper." "On paper," Aldous said. She nodded once with the finality of a woman closing a ledger. "Thank you for coming forward," she said. "Walt will see you out." She went back to the kitchen. "Hey!" James found her there 20 minutes later. She was at the table with a sheet of paper and a pen, writing in the careful, compact hand he recognized from her letters. Notes, dates, names, the evidence of a woman who understood that memory was fallible and paper was not. She didn't look up when he came in. "Nora," he said. "I'm all right," she said. She kept writing. "You don't have to be all right immediately." "I know." She finished the sentence she was on and set down the pen. She looked at her hands. The cloth wrapping on the cuts from the canyon was gray with use, and needed to be changed. She'd been meaning to do it since morning and kept being pulled to other things. They were trying to make sure I never reached you, she said. Yes, if I had taken the road instead of the canyon, you would have arrived safely, he said, and I would have been dead. She looked at that for a moment, all of its implications. The canyon and the rocks and the blood on the stirrup and the thread-thin pulse she'd found under her fingers. The night counting his breaths. It's strange, she said. The thing that was meant to keep us apart is the reason we're here. I've been thinking about that, he said. She looked at him. I've been thinking, he said carefully, that I spent a long time being strategic about everything in my life because the ranch required it. Every decision justified by its function. Every relationship measured by what it could bear. He sat down across from her. And then a woman who was supposed to arrive on the safe road took the canyon path instead. And the most important thing that has happened to me in 9 years happened because neither of us was where we were supposed to be. Nora was quiet. I'm not asking you to decide anything, he said. I meant what I said about giving you time. I'll accept whatever you decide. He paused. I just wanted you to know that what Aldous said today doesn't change anything from my side. You were in danger because of my enemies, and you survived it because of who you are. Whatever you decide about staying or going, that's the truth, and it doesn't have conditions. Nora looked at him for a long moment. Then she reached across the table and held out her wrapped hand, not reaching for him exactly, just placing it there. An offering. A deliberate small act by a woman who made her choices with full intention. He looked at her hand. Then he covered it with his. They sat like that at the kitchen table while the afternoon light shifted, while the sounds of the ranch moved around them, fence work and cattle, and the ordinary, irreducible rhythm of a working property finding its way back to itself. Outside the window, Walt Keegan walked past, glanced in, and kept walking without breaking his stride. On the desk in the next room under the lamp, the brass music box sat with its lid open. The railroad correspondence and the original survey spread out beside it where Draper had laid them after documenting them. His father had built that false bottom in 1867, the year the first railroad men had come out to look at the land. He had said that evening at supper, "There will come a day when someone needs those documents, and I want to make sure they're still there." James had not thought, when he'd ridden out alone that morning, that the someone would be a woman from St. Louis who had walked into a canyon with a traveling case and found him under the rocks. He had not thought that the person who would carry his father's legacy safely through a crisis would be someone he had known for less than 48 hours. He thought about it now. He thought about 12 pages of letters. He thought about the particular care she had taken in every one of them to say exactly what she meant, not more, not less. He thought about a woman who had written in her third letter, "I do not require a romantic man. I require an honest one. The rest is a matter of time and effort, and I have both." He had read that sentence 4 times and then written back, "I believe we are going to understand each other." He had not known then how thoroughly that would turn out to be true. The following 4 days were the kind that carved themselves into memory. Ashford Ridge resumed the rhythms of a working property fence, repairs cattle counts, the ordinary accountable business of land that had been fought for and held. The U.S. Marshal's office in Prescott responded to Draper's telegram within 24 hours. A federal deputy arrived on the second day with the authority to detain Sinclair, pending a formal hearing, and to transmit the documents to the federal district court. Judge Hartwell resigned from his appointment on the 3rd day before he could be summoned. It did not help him in the end. Henry Brock's testimony, his original correspondence with the railroad, his signed statement from the survey filing his clear and unshakable account of the chain of custody for the documents, was the kind of testimony that turns a case from arguable to settled. Nora moved through all of it with the same focused efficiency she brought to everything. She managed the documentation. She organized the timeline of evidence. She corresponded with the marshal's deputy in a series of letters that the deputy later described to Draper as the most logically structured legal summaries he had received from someone who was not a lawyer. She also, on the first morning, found the water rights discrepancy. James came to his office at dawn on the second day to find a sheet of paper on his desk with the corrected figures for the North Creek, claimed the one that had lapsed when the Harmon family moved out, and that no one had refiled because no one had noticed it lapsed. The figures were written in Nora's compact, precise hand with a note at the bottom. "This should have been corrected months ago. I have the land office record. I'll file it this afternoon if you'll give me your authorization." He sat looking at it for a long moment. Then he looked at the door. Nora was already in the next room at the kitchen table with a second file open. How long did this take you, he asked. 2 hours, she said without looking up. Your bookkeeping is thorough. It just needed someone to read it from outside. Walt Keegan, passing through the kitchen with a saddle over one arm, paused in the doorway long enough to catch James's eye and raise one deliberate eyebrow. Then he kept going. On the second afternoon, Pete Haskell came to the ranch. He arrived on horseback, riding slowly, and he tied his horse at the gate and stood there for a moment with the look of a man deciding whether to keep walking or turn back. Walt saw him from the stable and sent word to the house, and it was Nora who came to the gate to meet him. Haskell looked older than he had at the station. The specific aging of a man who has been carrying something he knows he should have put down sooner. Mrs. he started. He had heard the name apparently. Dusty Creek was not a large county. Miss Calloway, he corrected. Mr. Haskell, Nora said. He turned his hat in his hands. I came to apologize, he said, for what I didn't say at the station. I knew those men had been through. I knew what they were planning or close enough to it. I knew what was in that canyon. He stopped. I was afraid. That's the whole of it. I was afraid, and I told myself that telling you to take the longer road was enough. And I knew it wasn't. You did tell me, Nora said. Not clearly enough. No, she agreed. Not clearly enough. But you told me. She paused. I chose the canyon anyway. That was my decision, not yours. Still, he said. Still, she agreed. She looked at him. He met her eyes steadily for the first time. Are you willing to testify at the hearing, she asked, about what you saw and what you were told? That's why I came, he said. Aldous came to see me yesterday. Told me what he'd told you. A pause. I'm glad you're alive, Miss Calloway. I'm glad you didn't take the long road. Nora was quiet for a moment. She thought about the canyon. She thought about a pulse under her fingers in the dark and the quality of stillness that meant a person was still deciding whether to stay. So am I, she said. Come inside, I'll get you coffee, and you can tell me exactly what you're prepared to say in front of the marshal. James watched from the porch as she walked Haskell to the door. Walt came and stood beside him without being asked. She's going to run this county in 10 years, Walt said. She's going to run this ranch in 10 months, James said. Walt made the sound that was almost a laugh. Does she know that? I think she's already started, James said, and is being polite about it. Walt nodded slowly. He looked out at the gate at the repaired south fence at the cattle visible on the far pasture. She asked me this morning about the water rights on the Copper Creek tributary, he said, whether we'd filed the correct claim when the Hennessy family moved out 2 years ago. James turned to look at him. Had we, he said. No, Walt said. We had not. A pause. She found it in the land office record she borrowed from the deputy. Another pause. I filed it this afternoon. James looked back toward the door where Nora had disappeared with Haskell. Walt, he said. Boss, when the hearing is finished, he paused. I'm going to ask her to marry me. Properly. Not as strategy, not as legal standing, actually ask her. He was quiet for a moment, with the full understanding that she'll tell me exactly what she thinks of the question and may very possibly outline a set of conditions I'll need to agree to in advance. Walt was quiet for a long time. Sounds about right, he said. I wanted you to know. I appreciate it. Walt started back toward the stable. He stopped after 3 steps without turning around. She won't say no, he said, but she'll definitely have conditions. He kept walking. On the 4th evening, the night before the hearing, Nora couldn't sleep. She knew it wasn't the hearing itself. She had been prepared for that since the first morning. She knew exactly what she was going to say and in what order, and she was not afraid of standing in front of a judge and saying clearly what she had seen. It was something else. The kind of sleeplessness that comes when a person is standing at the edge of a change they have chosen and can see both sides of it clearly, and their mind won't stop walking the line between them. She went to the kitchen. James was already there. He was sitting at the table with a cup of coffee gone cold. His broken leg extended straight before him, a sheet of paper in front of him that he turned face down when she came through the door. You're writing the letter, she said. I was trying to, he said. It wasn't going well. She got herself a cup from the stove and sat down across from him. To who? He looked at her steadily. You, he said. She looked at the face-down paper. I couldn't say it out loud without planning first, he said. That's a character flaw. I'm aware of it. Oh, it's not a flaw, she said. You're a careful man. You say things when you know what you mean. I know what I mean, he said. I just couldn't find the right arrangement of words. Then say it without the right words, she said. I'm a practical woman. I can work with an approximation. He looked at her for a long moment across the kitchen table. Two people with cold coffee, the desert night pressing dark against the windows, 4 days of everything between them. Then he said it without the right words, plainly and directly, the way she'd asked him to. I want you to stay on, he said. Not through the hearing, not through the winter. I want you to stay because this ranch is what my father built, and I have spent 9 years fighting to keep it, and I have never once in those 9 years looked out at it and thought, I want someone to see this with me. Until now. He paused. I want you to stay because you read ledgers at dawn and argue water rights with my foreman and told Ward Sinclair to his face what he was without your voice changing once. I want you to stay because every letter you ever wrote me was honest even when honesty was inconvenient, and I have not had enough of that in my life. He stopped. I want to marry you, he said. If you'll have me. Knowing everything now, the land dispute, and the enemies, and the ranch, and the letters, and the canyon, and all of it, I'm asking you honestly, and I'll accept whatever answer you give. The kitchen was very quiet. Nora held her cold cup in both hands and looked at the man across the table. She thought about a letter she had read so many times the folds had gone soft. She thought about standing on a train platform with a traveling case and no one coming and making the decision to walk anyway, not from bravery, not from recklessness, but from the plain inability to choose otherwise when there was still something to be done. She thought about a pulse under her fingers in the dark, thin and irregular, and fighting. The long night of counting breaths, the feeling that had been with her through all of it, not fear, not heroism, just the simple insistence of a woman who had always believed that if you were the one standing there, you were the one who had to act. She set down her cup. You have conditions, she said. He blinked. Then something moved in his face that was unmistakably the beginning of a genuine smile. Tell me. The North Creek water rights, she said, filed and secured within the week. Not a promise done. Done. I have full standing on the property accounts. Not advisory, not courtesy consultation. Actual legal standing. Done. She paused. And third, he said, the cabin, she said, in the canyon, the one where I kept you alive. He looked at her. I want it repaired and maintained, she said. Not as a storage outbuilding, as a place. She paused. It's where I decided to stay. The first night when I sat in the dark, listening to your breathing, and the riders were on the ridge, and I didn't leave. Another pause. I want to keep it. James Carter looked at Nora Calloway across the kitchen table in the late September dark, and whatever he had expected the third condition to be, it had not been that. Something moved in him the way things move when they find the place they were always supposed to be. Done, he said. His voice had gone quieter than before. She nodded once with the finality of a woman settling an important matter. Yes, she said. Yes, he repeated. That's my answer, she said. Yes. Outside, the desert was very still. The stars were out in the numbers you only see in country this open, and the south fence was repaired, and the cattle were settled, and somewhere in the house, Walt Keegan was asleep in the chair by the stable door, which was where he always slept when there was something worth watching over. Inside the kitchen, the lamp threw warm light across the table, across the cold cups and the face-down letter, in the brass music box that Nora had brought from the desk and set between them sometime in the last 10 minutes. Neither of them had noticed exactly when. James reached across the table and picked up the box. He turned it over in his hands the way he had turned it over in his hands every day for 9 years. My father used to say, he said that the thing about building something that lasts is that you can't build it alone. You can start alone. You can hold it alone for a while. But what it actually becomes the thing that's worth passing on, that requires two people looking at it together and deciding what they want it to be. Nora was quiet. He built this ranch from 40 acres and 1 horse, James said. He always said the 40 acres were the easy part. What was the hard part? He looked at her across the lamp and the music box and the quiet kitchen. Deciding what it was for, he said. Nora held his gaze for a moment. Then she reached out and tilted the music box gently to the upright position and lifted the lid. The 8 bars of Something Sweet filled the kitchen, clear and small and precise, the way music is when it's been kept in a box and saved. Neither of them spoke. They sat in the kitchen while the music played through once and then again, and then wound down to silence. End of part 3. Word count, 3,200 words. Part 4. The hearing. The hearing lasted most of Thursday. Aldous testified first for nearly 2 hours. His account was precise and in the end complete, the kind of completeness That happens when a man has spent the night deciding that the distinction between what he chose to know and what he chose not to know was no longer one he could maintain. He gave names and dates and figures. He described the payment to Judge Hartwell and the falsification of the survey documents and the instructions issued to the men in Copper Canyon. He described the contact inside the St. Louis Correspondence Agency and the arrangements that had been made regarding the woman coming from Missouri. The courtroom in Dusty Creek was standing room, people spilling into the doorway out onto the board sidewalk. The whole small county had come because, in a place this size, when the largest story anyone could remember is finally being told in the open, nobody stays away. Pete Haskell testified for 30 minutes. He was a careful man and a frightened one, but he had made his decision before he walked through the door, and he said it plainly, every word, and including the instructions he'd been given, the money he'd been offered, and the reason he had instead told a woman from St. Louis to take the longer road and hoped it would be enough. When the marshal asked him why he'd warned her, he said, because she looked like a woman who had come a long way for a decent reason, and I had enough left in me to not want to be the one who kept her from it. The silence in the courtroom after that had weight. Rafael Moreno testified about 3 years of fraudulent water claims and cattle driven off his land on forged documents. Henry Brock testified about the original railroad correspondence in his own signed statement from the survey filing steady and clear, the voice of a man who had been waiting a long time to say what he knew and was determined to say it right. 2 men from Sinclair's own operation testified quietly, carefully, with the look of men who understood they were stepping off a structure that was sinking and had enough self-preservation left to do it while there was still time. Then the marshal called Nora Calloway. She walked to the front of the courtroom in the spare dress from her traveling case, the one she'd put on the night before because the other one was past repair, pressed clean and worn, with the easy confidence of a woman who had long since stopped measuring her worth by what she had on. She stood before the marshal and she told the story. She told it plainly, without embellishment, without drama, in the level voice she'd used in field tents and hospital wards when what the situation required was clarity. She told it from the moment she left the station to the moment Draper had ridden back with Sinclair between his deputies. She told it completely, and she did not leave anything out. The courtroom was silent the entire time she spoke. When she finished, the marshal looked at her for a long moment. He was a broad-shouldered man from the federal district office, not easily impressed, who had heard a good deal of testimony in his years. "Miss Calloway," he said, "you walked into Copper Canyon alone on foot with no knowledge of the territory and rendered medical aid to a man who had been ambushed and left for dead." "Yes, sir." "You transported him to shelter, treated his injuries, and protected him through the night against men who were actively searching for him." "Yes, sir." "The following morning, you obtained the key evidence in this case, directed the organization of the property's defense, and confronted the defendant in the yard of the property with a direct account of his actions." Nora paused. "I would say the events unfolded with contributions from many people, but you were at the center of most of them." She looked at the marshal steadily. "I was where I was needed," she said. He held her gaze for a moment. Then he said simply, "Thank you for your testimony, Miss Calloway." She walked back to her seat. James was in the row behind the bar. He had been watching her the entire time she spoke with the expression of a man who keeps thinking he has understood something and keeps discovering there is more to understand. She sat down beside him and looked straight ahead. He leaned toward her slightly. "You said center of most of them," he said quietly. "That was accurate. The smoke bundles were a legitimate field technique," she said. He pressed his lips together in the way she had come to recognize as a man who was not smiling and also not smiling. The verdict came at 4:30. Ward Sinclair guilty on all charges: conspiracy to commit murder, fraud against a federal officer, corruption of a judicial appointment, extortion. The marshal added a charge of intimidation against the Moreno family and the Brock family, which Sinclair's remaining lawyer argued against and lost. Sinclair stood and received it with the flat expression of a man who had already made his accounting in the desert 2 nights ago and was not going to spend any more effort on the result. He did not look at James. He looked once briefly at Nora, a final calculation, the expression of someone filing a last entry in a ledger he was closing. Then he looked at the floor. The courtroom released its breath. Not celebration, not the loud, undignified noise of a crowd enjoying someone's fall. Something quieter and more solid than that. The sound of a weight lifting. The sound of people remembering what the air had felt like before it was there. Rafael Moreno shook James's hand and then turned and shook Nora's. Henry Brock stopped talking for a moment, which required some effort. Pete Haskell, standing at the back of the courtroom with the look of a man who had not been sure he would make it through the day, caught Nora's eye across the crowd and gave a small, deliberate nod. She nodded back. They rode back to the ranch in the long evening light. For the first mile, neither of them spoke. Some things are complete in themselves and don't need commentary. Then Nora said, "The North Creek water rights." James almost laughed, a real one, the kind that comes from somewhere genuine. "Today, I just want you to have it in mind," she said. "It's in mind," he said. "It is always going to be in mind." She looked at him sideways. The evening light was doing something to the desert around them, turning the red rock gold, throwing the shadows long, making the whole country look for a moment like a painting rather than the real thing. But it was real. All of it was real. "I wrote back to that letter," she said, "because it was the most honest thing I had ever read from a man I didn't know." She was quiet for a moment. "Most men who advertise for a wife write about what they're offering. You wrote about what you needed." James was quiet. "You said you needed someone who understood that a partnership requires honesty more than sentiment," she said. I had read that sentence 6 times before I sat down to answer Mud, because it was the first time I had ever seen the thing I believed about the world written down by someone else. "I meant it," he said. "I know." And then I read the rest of the letters, and the sentiment was there too, just underneath. The way water runs under rock, you couldn't quite keep it out. He rode beside her in the evening light and said nothing. "That's the part that got me on the train," she said. "The sentiment under the rock." He looked at her. She looked back at him with those steady, clear eyes that had been reading him since the first moment he'd opened his own in the canyon and found her kneeling beside him with her hands bleeding and her voice level and her mind already 3 steps ahead of what needed to be done. "I want you to know that," she said, "so there's nothing unsaid." "There's nothing unsaid," he agreed. They turned in through the Ashford Ridge gate as the last of the evening light fell across the ranch. The repaired fence, the settled cattle, the lamplight already showing in the bunkhouse windows where the men were finishing supper. Walt's horse was tied at the stable, which meant he'd beaten them back. The canyon cabin sat a quarter-mile east, waiting for the repairs she'd specified and would oversee herself when the week's work allowed. Nora pulled up at the porch step and dismounted with the easy confidence of a woman who had been doing things for the first time her whole life and had learned that competence followed willingness the way water follows slope. She looked up at the house. His father had built it from 40 acres and 1 horse and a promise he'd made to himself. It had been fought for and held, and was now, as of this week, fully and legally secure. The forged documents invalidated the original survey filed with the federal court. The right-of-way negotiation restored to the terms the railroad and the Ashford family had agreed on 20 years ago. James came up beside her. "Welcome home," he said. She looked at him. She looked at the ranch around her, the open sky and the distant ridge, and the wide, difficult, honest country she had walked into with a traveling case and a letter and 2 bare hands, and that had given her in 4 days more life than she had expected to find in a year. She thought about a train platform in Dusty Creek with no one on it, about a decision made in the particular quiet of a woman who had run out of reasons to wait for someone else to act. She thought about all the ways this had almost not happened. The road not taken, the rocks in the canyon, the long, dark night of a fever that had nearly won, the riders on the ridge, and Sinclair's pleasant face, and Pete Haskell's careful eyes, and the brass music box with its false bottom, and 9 years of safekeeping, and 8 bars of something sweet. She thought about the fact that the thing meant to separate them had instead brought them together, and that a frightened man at a train station had tried to do the only right thing available to him, and that she had walked into a canyon because she was the kind of woman who walked into canyons, and that all of it, every accidental, improbable, barely survived step of it, had led here, to a porch step, a September evening. A man standing beside her who had written honestly about what he needed and who had turned out to mean it. "Home," she said, not trying the word, not borrowing it, saying it the way a person says a thing they have decided is true and intend to keep being true for as long as they have breath to say it. She took the first step up to the porch. Behind her, James Ashford, rancher letter writer man, who had been found under rocks and given back the life he had nearly lost, followed her up the steps of the house his father had built on the land he had fought for and kept beside the woman who had carried him through the dark without asking who he was. He had written to the agency in St. Louis because a lawyer had told him that a married man had stronger standing in a property dispute. He had written 12 pages of letters because a woman in St. Louis wrote back honestly, and he had found that he did not want to stop. He had ridden out alone to meet her at the station because he had decided after 9 years of holding everything together by himself that he was done making decisions for reasons of strategy alone. None of those reasons had prepared him for a woman who would find him under a rock slide and decide on the basis of a pulse in a canyon and two bare hands that he was worth the effort. He understood climbing the porch steps beside her in the September evening that he had not known what he was writing toward when he wrote the first letter. He understood that now. Epilogue 1 year later. The canyon cabin was finished in October. Nora oversaw it herself, the new roof, the repaired walls, the window that let in the morning light from the east. She had the original cot moved to one corner because some things deserved to stay where they were. She had a bookshelf built along the north wall, and on it she placed her medical kit, her spare notebook, and her mother-in-law's copy of a household management book that James's father had sent away for in 1855, and that had lived in the ranch house library for 20 years unread. She read it in the evenings when the work was done and the light was right. On the shelf beside it, she placed the brass music box. Not locked away, not hidden, just there where the light hit it in the mornings, and the 8 bars of something sweet could be heard on the evenings when the lid was open and the breeze came through the window. Clara arrived in November on the train from St. Louis. She was 12 years old and had her father's steady eyes and her mother's refusal to be impressed by anything until she'd had time to evaluate it properly. She stepped off the train at Dusty Creek Station, looked at the painted sign Population 187, and then looked at James Ashford, who had come with Nora to meet her, and said, "You're taller than I expected." "You're more direct than your letters suggested," James said. Clara considered him for a moment. "Mother says that's a virtue." "Your mother's right," he said. Rafael Moreno's youngest son, Tomas, the 14-year-old, who had attached himself to Nora on the night of the assault, became Clara's particular friend within a week. Walt Keegan, who had no tolerance for children who didn't pull their weight, made an exception for Clara after she spent an afternoon correctly identifying a fence post that was 3 inches out of true and explaining in precise terms how she knew. He said nothing about this to anyone, but he started leaving small tasks in her path, the way a man leaves things for someone he's decided to teach. Pete Haskell gave testimony at the federal hearing in December. He gave it plainly and without evasion, and the marshal thanked him for it. He kept his position at the station for 3 more years before retiring to a small house on the edge of town where he grew vegetables and read and occasionally watched the trains come in. Henry Brock used his portion of the settlement. The federal court had ordered restitution for the properties acquired through fraud to buy back a quarter of the Brock homestead. He didn't return to ranching, he was too old for that, but he planted an orchard, and in the spring of the following year, when the trees were still small and uncertain, he stood at the fence and looked at them for a long time with the expression of a man who has been given back something he'd accepted was lost and is still working out what to do with the unexpected gift of it. The railroad right-of-way was negotiated in February. James handled it with the original survey documents in his father's correspondence, and the terms were the ones his father had envisioned: fair compensation, a 10-year construction timeline, and a provision that the south quarter of Ashford Ridge would retain water rights over the creek that ran through the construction corridor. Nora reviewed the contract before he signed it. She found 2 clauses that needed revision. He revised them. The railroad man from Tucson, who had been dealing with territorial landowners for 15 years, wrote in his report to the company office, "The Ashford negotiation was the most thorough I have encountered. Mrs. Ashford in particular demonstrated an unusual command of the legal precedents involved. I recommend we retain her for future right-of-way discussions if possible." James left the letter on her desk. She read it, set it down, and went back to the ledger she was working on. He watched from the doorway. She looked up after a moment. "The East Fence lease rates," she said. "I want to talk to you about the East Fence lease rates." "I know you do," he said. "Tomorrow." "Tomorrow," he agreed. She went back to the ledger. He stood in the doorway for another moment looking at her, at the woman who had walked into a canyon with a traveling case and found him under the rocks, and decided on the basis of nothing more certain than a pulse and a principle that the work was worth doing. He thought about his father, who had built this ranch from nothing and had said that the hard part was deciding what it was for. He understood now what his father had meant. He went to make the coffee, and the ranch moved around them with the sound of a life being built. The ordinary, irreducible, accumulating sound of 2 people who had decided to look at the same thing and build it together. And outside the window, Desert was very wide and very honest, and the canyon was 3 miles west, and the cabin was there with its new roof and its old cot and its music box on the shelf, and all of it was exactly as it was supposed to be. She had come to Arizona looking for a decent life and an honest partnership with a stranger. What she found was a man worth carrying, a fight worth winning, and a home she had earned with her own 2 hands. And that is exactly where she stayed.